to start by saying that this policy and the procedures, which are more or less the guidance that goes with it, are developed by a team of people within NOAA, and a lot of it is based on the best practices of what we were doing already. So if a lot of this sounds familiar, if a lot of this sounds like, oh, well, that's what's in the 2008 rule, or that's what the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing, well, there's a good reason for that, because those were good ideas and we adopted them. But some of this will be a little different for a couple of reasons. One is that we're working a lot in coastal areas, and coastal areas have their own set of problems. And also, we have a wide range of authorities. This is a NOAA policy as opposed to a NMFS policy because it includes our National Marine Sanctuaries Program, which is in the National Ocean Service. And so we're going to start the day by talking about some of those authorities, and so that you'll have a sense of the breadth of the authorities that we're using when we talk about mitigation. Our consultations occur only when there's a federal trigger. And the most common federal triggers that we're dealing with are Rivers and Harbors Act permits, Clean Water Act permits, Federal Power Act licenses, or if something is federally funded or authorized. Some of these trigger authorities have a consultation requirement in it already, saying that you need to consult with either the Fish and Wildlife Service. If it's an old authority, pre-NOAA, it will just say the Fish and Wildlife Service. But even if NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service isn't mentioned in the authority, all of those responsibilities got transferred to NOAA when we were created. So starting with the Rivers and Harbors Act, those are two sections, Section 10, permits for structures, and Section 9, bridges, dams, dikes, causeways. We're often doing consultations on either just a Rivers and Harbors Act permit or perhaps a permit under the Rivers and Harbors Act as well as the Clean Water Act. I imagine most of the people in this room are very familiar with the Clean Water Act. There's a lot of guidance that has been written for that, including the 92 NOAA for a coordination process and the 404B1 guidelines. And this, as I'm sure you know, is administered by both EPA and the Corps. We also have a wide range of consultation and trustee authorities. They include everything from the the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, to things that are relatively new, like essential fish habitat. So the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act is one of those acts that does not mention NOAA or the National Marine Fisheries Service because it was created in 1934 and we were created around the 1970s. But this act is the first consultation authority. It's the one that National Marine Fisheries Service was using before we got essential fish habitat. It's very broad. It basically says that there needs to be a consultation with any action that might modify a natural stream or a body of water. And it describes that when we are consulting on these projects, that we shall describe the damage to the wildlife and measures proposed for mitigating or compensating, or the project proponent should. There's a report we write, and hopefully the information we need is in the permit or draft permit. Newest of these is Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, which is a mouthful. The majority of that act actually deals with the regulation of fishing. But in that act, there is the essential fish habitat provision that requires federal agencies to consult with NOAA Fisheries on all actions or proposed actions that you authorize, fund, or undertake that may adversely affect EFH. And this is not limited to state or federal waters. And it actually isn't even limited to essential fish habitat itself. If there's an action outside of essential fish habitat that may adversely affect essential fish habitat, there's a responsibility to consult on that as well. So EFH is defined in the Act as waters and substrate necessary to fish for spawning, feeding, or growth to maturity. And then the EFH regulations go on to provide more details on what we mean by waters and what we mean by substrate. And an adverse effect is any impact that reduces the quality or quality of EFH, and that can be direct adverse effects, indirect adverse effects like loss of prey, and as I stated earlier, it can be either inside EFH or outside. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong green button. So the EFH consultation process begins with the submission of an EFH assessment by the action agency that includes a description of the proposed action, an analysis of the effects, the federal agency's views on whether those effects are adverse or not, and then a discussion of proposed mitigation if applicable. And then we provide what are called EFH conservation recommendations. And then one of the unique things about the EFH process is that the action agency is required to provide us a response within 30 days, telling us how they're going to incorporate our conservation recommendations. And that 30 days can be, there's a lot of flexibility on that because I know a lot of these processes take a long time to work through. So 30 days or at least 10 days before rendering a final decision. So mitigation comes into such a fish habitat or Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act consultations in a couple of places. And I'm putting these two together because we often do those two consultations together. We really like to be engaged in pre-application consultations so that we can emphasize avoidance and minimization. The EFH regulations have something called a general concurrence. It's kind of like a general permit. And if you qualify for a general concurrence, then you're done. No more consultation needed. And then at the other end of the process, we can recommend avoidance, minimization, or compensation on the conservation recommendations or the Fish and Wildlife Coordination report that we send to the action agency. All right, moving on to the Endangered Species Act, which I'm not an expert in, but I've talked to a lot of them, and I'd like to think they've taught me a couple of things. The purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to conserve endangered and threatened species and the ecosystems on which they depend. It's key to understand that the definition of conservation in the Act is using all methods and procedures necessary to bring listed species to the point where ESA protections are no longer necessary. So all methods and procedures covers a lot. Just in case you're not familiar with the ESA, there are 3 levels of being listed under the Act. You're either endangered, in danger of being extinct, threatened, likely to become endangered, and then there are candidate species. People will petition National Marine Fisheries Service or will decide based on input from our own scientists to review whether or not a species should be listed. There are 3 sections in the ESA that are relevant for mitigation. There are a lot of other sections in ESA, but we're not going to go into them. Section 7 deals with interagency coordination, and that includes consultations. Section 9 deals with prohibited acts, and that includes something called take, which is basically the killing or damaging or harassing, or there's a whole long definition of take, of listed species. And then Section 10 deals with what are called exceptions. So there's something called incidental take, where if you are going to harm a species in the carrying out the normal function of a project and it's not going to jeopardize the species, then you can be issued an incidental take permit that will allow you to do that. So normally take is prohibited, but you can get a permit for it. And then Section 10 also deals with habitat conservation plans. So the first part of Section 7, which is most people think of, that's the consultation section, and it is. But before you get to that part of Section 7, you have this Section 7A1, which again is kind of a broad, federal agencies shall use their authorities to carry out programs for the conservation of listed species. So this often results in federal agencies offering into partnerships or MOUs with National Marine Fisheries or Fish and Wildlife Service to fund conservation agreements, management plans, and recovery plans. So it's kind of like doing some of the work up front. And that can result in a candidate species not being listed, a threatened species not being bumped up to endangered. And then this is the section most people think of. Section A2, which is an Endangered Species Act consultation. And what you're looking for there is whether an action is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of listed species or is not going to destroy or adversely modify designated critical habitat. And as you might expect, there are definitions of all these things in the regulations. So if an action is likely to jeopardize, one of the things that NIMS will recommend in our biological opinion is a reasonable and prudent alternative. And this is a place for us to propose avoidance, minimization, compensation up front, because one of the neat things about the Endangered Species Act is that if you propose compensation as part of the proposed action, then that gets taken into account in the net balance of the effects of the action. They really used terms that are very similar, so it can take a while to realize what you're talking about. But in addition to reasonable and prudent alternatives to the proposed action, there are also reasonable and prudent measures, which are measures that will be taken to reduce the effect of the action, particularly on take, if you're issued an incidental take permit. And then conservation recommendations are just kind of non-binding recommendations that will minimize or avoid adverse effects. It could also include studies or monitoring or research to develop new information. So with our people who work in the Endangered Species Act, for a lot of time, they thought that they could not use compensatory mitigation for endangered species conservation. But our experts have saying, yes, absolutely we can. First of all, again, the definition of conservation is the use of all methods and procedures. And so there are a number of places where you can incorporate mitigation into ESA consultation. You can incorporate it into the proposed action, which if we get to work with people early enough is what we like to see. You can, as I said, incorporate it into a reasonable and prudent alternative. You can incorporate it into these conservation recommendations, and then you can incorporate it into reasonable and prudent measures. So banks and in lieu fees can be used as compensation under the Endangered Species Act, and we have a number of banks out on the West Coast for salmon that are doing this. That was a lot on listed species. It's a very complicated act, and I can't believe there's someone here who focuses on that and other things. You must have a very full brain. All right, so we're also going to talk just briefly about the Federal Power Act, because this is another authority that we have for working on mitigation. We consider FERC is required to consider our recommendations for ensuring that a project is best adapted to a comprehensive plan that is already in existence, like a watershed plan, a recovery plan, or something like that. We also make recommendations to mitigate damages and enhance fish and wildlife, and we can prescribe upstream and downstream fish passage requirements. And all of those can include avoiding, minimizing, or compensating for impacts. The fishway prescriptions are mandatory, and as you might imagine, also very contentious. And I think we have many file cases of court documents on our fishway prescriptions. And interestingly, under fishway prescriptions, it's not just federally managed species, but also ESA-listed species and state-managed forage species. And then the 10J recommendations are included in the hydropower licenses to, again, protect, mitigate damages to, and enhance fish and wildlife. So a lot of the consultations we do are combined. We have ESA, Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, and EFH together often. We also often have Federal Power Act and ESA consultations together. And something to keep in mind is that mitigation for a listed species, for example, might be different than mitigation for essential fish habitat. And our folks who work on the West Coast run into this a lot because they are doing combined consultations for salmon and groundfish for the same action. And the mitigation for salmon, which go all the way up in the river, is going to be different than the mitigation for groundfish who are out in the ocean. The next set of authorities we have are called our trustee authorities. And these have to do with the implementation of the Oil Pollution Act, CERCLA. So anytime there are impacts for hazardous waste, oil, or injury to sanctuaries, the Department of Commerce, which is where NOAA sits, Department of the Interior, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and USDA are federal trustees for those resources. They form a trustee council with people from states and tribes also, if applicable. Anyone tell me what CERCLA stands for? It's too early for that. We just call it Superfund. So CERCLA is the act that funds Superfund, and EPA does the designation and the cleanup of Superfund, but we're NOAA is one of the trustees for sites that affect our trust resources. OPA is a little easier, and this one is the one that deals with oil spills. And then finally, the National Marine Sanctuaries Act also establishes liability for any adverse effects to sanctuaries, and we are usually the primary trustee for dealing with recovering the costs to assess damages, replace, restore, and provide enforcement. So these programs are all come under something that we call NRDA, Natural Resource Damage Assessment. And the definition of restoration in that is that we want to rehabilitate, replace, or acquire the equivalent of injured natural resources. And acquiring the equivalent is often compensation and can be not only restoration but also preservation. Restoration has a couple of different definitions in NRDA, and they're kind of interesting. So we have early restoration, which is when someone knows they're responsible for an injury, they can go in and start restoring right away, and it's kind of a down payment on their ultimate liability. Then we have primary restoration, which is going to the site that's been injured and restoring it back to its original condition or as close to that as you can get. And then you have compensatory restoration, which to those of us who work in the Clean Water Act field, we would call compensatory mitigation. And that, in this definition, is to compensate for the interim losses. So those losses of functions and services that occur between the source was injured and when you finally get back to that pre-injury situation. And so NRDA is a very long and very complicated process because it involves lawyers, no offense, and it involves the public too. And the way it usually works is you have an assessment phase, you have a planning phase, you decide what everybody is responsible for, and there's usually litigation, although sometimes you can come to settlement through a negotiation process. And only then after that do you get to go in and restore after everybody's agreed what their liability is going to be. What's nice about using banks is that you can move that restoration phase before the settlement or litigation. A lot of times, if there is a bank selling NRDA credits, then the people who are responsible for the injury know up front about what it's going to cost to settle their liability. And the banks themselves can get started during the assessment and planning phase. And so you really shorten the time frame between the injury and the actual restoration. Okay. NOAA put some guidance out in 2016 and updated it in 2021 on how to make banks work for the NRDA process. There are a couple of limitations because the way NRDA talks about baseline conditions, and so they don't accept credits that were in the ground before the injury occurred, but they will accept credits that have accrued since the injury. And so this is guidance that sets all that out. There's an illustration of what I just talked about. So NOAA only accepts credits that have accrued after the injuries occurred, and preferably after we've verified the bank. But that, we have a little flexibility on that. All right. I don't see anyone asleep, which is pretty amazing because we just did a lot of dry stuff. But I would be happy to take any questions.
And some of the slides earlier where you were explaining about the NOAA, the consultation process, and the different points where things can occur, and there's mitigation recommendations. A lot of them are non-binding.
Yes, most of them are.
Most of them are non-binding, except for the fishways.
Yes.
Which I suppose would make sense if you're providing sort of lots of different options. But at some point, the mitigation has to happen. So is that why are they non-binding? Is it, I mean, I guess that's my question.
You'd have to ask Congress. You know, we obviously would prefer them to all be binding. But the role of the natural resource agencies typically is to advise, given our expertise. So we are not the decision makers. We don't issue the permits except in some of our programs. And there's some other agency that has to weigh not only our concerns, but also the concerns of other agencies. You can sometimes get into situations where what's good for the ducks is not good for the fish. And then there are also other public interest things that need to be weighed by FERC or by the Army Corps or by someone funding a project.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Don't you dare ask me a hard question.
I'm not going to ask you a question. I'm just going to add to this because I've flipped roles recently and I've ended up on the Army Corps side, and it's been interesting listening to some of the conversations because we'll have NIMPs from NOAA coming in and saying, we're recommending this, and the other side's going, well, we can't make recommendations. And I think that's where some of the authorities come into play, where like the services make recommendations, but then you have another agency, as Susan Marie was saying, can come in and say, okay, but we can add this as a condition of our permit and we can require it at that point. So it's the decision to make it required in order for the permit to go forward, which another agency like the Army Corps can go in and do. So that's, I think, the interplay between the different authorities. And I think sometimes there's a gap in the conversation that's happening between the recommendation, we're recommending it, and then the other side, but can we actually require this? And is this part of our authorities to be able to require? And so I think that's sometimes there's some question marks there and some back and forth that ends up happening.
I should also add that that's one of the reasons we like mitigation to be incorporated into the proposed project, because then it's part of the permit or it's part of the project, and then it is mandatory. Anyone else?
So you said on the West Coast there's ESA credits and EFH credits in certain areas, and oftentimes they probably overlap or don't overlap. Mm-hmm. But as part of CRs or part of compensatory mitigation, would let's say if an area they were offsetting EFH habitat, but there was no EFH credits available, would NOAA recommend utilizing if there was ESA credits? And so there's not that out of kind as opposed to a core out of kind, let's say non-title to title or something to that effect.
No, I mean, obviously any compensation is better than no compensation, but that would be, using ESA credits for EFH impacts would be pretty far down on the hierarchy. As I said, you're often looking at completely different species, and groundfish and salmon don't live, work, play in the same places. So one of the things we're trying to do on the West Coast, and I'm going to be very interested in the credit drought session that's later on in here, but one of the things we're trying to do is come up with new ways of using in lieu fee arrangements to provide compensation when there aren't credits, the appropriate credits on the ground. And I also, since you brought up EFH credits, I often get asked, are there EFH banks? And there are banks for the Clean Water Act, and that's usually what we're using for essential fish habitat impacts. Right. Well, thank you for sticking with me through that. We're going to move now to what's in the policy and the procedure. So we are going to talk not only about the mitigation policy, but also the procedures that provide details on how to implement it. So when the group of people who developed this policy got started, we asked you, what are the issues you're dealing with in mitigation? And we got a very long list, longer than that, but that was some of the key ones. We also asked our partners and other federal agencies, and we said, what are the issues you're dealing with respect to mitigation in coastal and marine environments, and also the riverine environments for anadromous fish? So we also asked our partners, and then we had to look at this list and say, well, what can we address in a policy, and what needs some other mechanism? Because policies are very specific mechanisms. They're decision-making mechanisms, and some of these issues are not issues of decision-making. They're issues of coordination or something else. Next. The other reason we decided we needed to know a mitigation policy is because we were already working under a wide variety of guidance documents, regulations, policies, MOAs. Some of them were from other agencies, some were from our agency, but they only dealt with one region, like the West Coast. Some of them only dealt with one resource, like coral. And so we needed a way to kind of bring that all under one umbrella. Next. So that is what this policy does. The policy is the capstone of our mitigation processes. The procedures help to describe how to implement the policy. It's all held up by our authorities. If any of you followed the Fish and Wildlife Services mitigation policies for the last few years, you might remember there was a lot of discussion about, should it be no net loss? Should it be net gain? And we talked to our lawyers about it, and they said, just go with what's in your authorities, because some of our authorities let us ask for net gain, and some of them don't. So it all depends on what authority we're working under. And then in between the two, we have regional guidance, we have program guidance, we have habitat guidance. And so this is the way it's all going to work together. Next. So as I said, a policy is a decision-making tool. It's a set of principles to guide our mitigation decisions and ideally achieve positive conservation outcomes. And these goals include preventing and offsetting losses of trust resources, helping action agencies and project proponents develop appropriate mitigation measures, and to be consistent, effective, and transparent in our mitigation processes. Next. So as I just spent the last hour talking about, we have a lot of authorities. They are implemented in a lot of different places and for many different species. Next. One of the key things about talking about mitigation is that it includes all three parts of that meaning: avoid, minimize, and compensate. As we were running this policy through NOAA higher-ups, they started asking us about climate mitigation or flooding mitigation, and we said, gee, we don't deal with that. So we're thinking of this as a regulatory definition of mitigation. A number of the programs covered by the policy don't even use the term mitigation, but they use terms that mean what mitigation is. Next slide. So as we're talking today, please be very thoughtful and intentional about the terms that you use. A lot of times when people say mitigation, what they really are talking about is compensatory mitigation, but that's a long word, so they just say mitigation. But that means we forget that mitigation is avoidance and minimizing as well as compensating. And so just wanted to make that point. Go ahead. Oh, so now you're going to get to just every second click it. So not yet. So NOAA Trust Resources, that's a fun term, right? I was surprised that we didn't already have a definition of NOAA Trust Resources in the agency. So we created one. Actually, Catherine created one. And so it includes, here we go, commercial and recreational fishery resources, endangered and threatened marine species, keep going, just like every second. There we go, there's our salmon. marine mammals, marine turtles, a whole bunch of habitats like mangrove, seagrass, coral, and national marine sanctuaries, national monuments, keep going. And last but not least, habitats associated with the Great Lakes, because although we don't manage federal fisheries there, we do manage national estuarine research reserves and other things. Okay, next. So there are 8 policy statements in the policy, and some of them are fairly simple and might look fairly obvious, like use the best scientific information available. Some of them are more nuanced and complicated, like use preservation appropriate, taking into account the high risk of habitat loss in coastal marine landscapes. And so we'll be talking more about some of these policy statements than others. Go ahead. So the topics in the procedure, some of them deal with more details on the policy statements, like the landscape and seascape policy statement. There's a fair amount of information in the procedures on how to do that. And then some of them are more background information, like the methods of compensatory mitigation and mechanisms of compensatory mitigation. So it's not a one-for-one lineup of policy statement and procedure statement, but they do work together. And by the way, at the bottom of the agenda are links or ways to find these documents on the internet. Okay. So apply the mitigation sequence appropriately. This refers to avoidance first, then minimization, and then compensation. However, we don't have a hard and fast requirement for that, because for some of our authorities, that won't achieve the best conservation outcomes. So depending upon the authority, there's flexibility. Now, under the Clean Water Act, you guys know that it's always avoid first, then compensate, then minimize, then compensate. But if we're dealing with the Endangered Species Act or some of our other acts, there's more flexibility to put, for example, compensation upfront into the proposed project if that will achieve the best conservation outcome. We also state that in applying the sequence, we'll generally recommend or require avoiding adverse impacts to high-value habitats. Next. So, best science. This is another kind of obvious one that will use the best scientific information available in recommending, planning, and implementing and monitoring mitigation. And our types of scientific information include the usual stuff, as well as appropriate local and traditional knowledge, particularly when you're dealing with fisheries in places like Alaska. The people who have the best information are the people who live there and have been fishing there for generations. And another important thing, I think, in terms of applying best science is the monitoring of mitigation projects and research regarding those projects. Next. So in the procedures, we have a section on natural resource assessment and valuation that will help with implementing the best available science. It includes doing habitat assessment using the scarcity, suitability, and importance of that habitat. It talks about using evaluation resources. You've got a lot of species in one place. You can't assess all of them, so pick a species like the pillar coral that can stand in for a whole bunch of species when you're doing assessments. And then, of course, that if you are, the assessment method you're using for the impact should be the same one you're using to assess mitigation options. The third policy statement is that we should be using a holistic landscape or seascape approach. This came out of a movement under the Clean Water Act away from on-site in-kind compensation to using what's called a watershed approach, which in general I think has been a good idea. The only issue is that when you apply that to a marine or an estuarine area, a watershed is often not as relevant as, say, the entire bay, a littoral cell, a coral complex, a reef complex. And so we are trying to adapt that approach to a marine and estuarine area by talking about landscapes and seascapes instead of watersheds. Go ahead. And in the procedures, we have an entire section on compensatory mitigation in the context of a landscape or seascape approach. Instead of Offsite, we talk about the proximity of compensation to the impact. Instead of in-kind, out-of-kind, we talk about equivalency and ecological type. And then there's also a section on preservation, which I'll get into a little bit more later on. And then we also have a section on compensation in dynamic environments that is relevant to taking a landscape and seascape approach. So policy statement 4 is kind of we want this to be lasting on the landscape statement, that there's a lot of uncertainty around doing anything in the coastal areas, mitigation included. And so we talk about wanting to provide a high degree of effectiveness and durability, and that in doing that, we should be having measurable performance standards, detailed monitoring plans, adaptive management plans, long-term management plans, all the stuff that's already required under the EPA Core 2008 rule. Next. And in terms of timing of compensatory mitigation, we are generally preferring in advance compensation. We don't specifically say it has to be a bank, but in advance compensation is preferred. However, again, we're always looking for the best conservation outcome. And if that in advance compensation isn't the right kind of compensation, if it's that salmon credit that's not going to do anything for the ground fish, then that's not going to be our preference. And in the procedures, we also have sections on maximizing certainty of mitigation measures, and we have sections on monitoring, adaptive management, and site protection. And a lot of this is drawn from existing documents. Next. Okay, climate change. We were very happy to be able to include a statement on climate change in this policy, because when we were working on it, we weren't allowed to say climate change for a good 4 years. But we finalized it in a time when we could talk about climate change, and talking about considering climate change and climate resilience when evaluating and developing mitigation measures. So this has to do with applying climate change considerations specifically to mitigation, specifically to the avoidance, minimization, and compensation, and looking at how the effects of sea level rise or changes in species and habitat ranges interact with what we're trying to do for mitigation. So the procedures also contain a section on climate change, talking about adaptive management and employing the best scientific information available. Next. Okay, could you go back one? I wasn't sure what slide was next. With respect to best scientific information available, we don't talk about any particular climate change scenario that needs to be used, because our programs use different climate change scenarios themselves. Next. All right. This is our proportionality statement, and this is kind of a balancing statement. So you have probably heard some people complaining about agencies asking for too much compensation, that we don't have the authority to ask for as much compensation as we are. So this statement says that that's not what we're doing. We're going to be asking for mitigation that's proportional to the impacts, but we're also not going to accept less than what our authorities allow us to ask for. And so that's the second part of this statement, that it offsets those impacts to the full extent provided by our authorities. That's going to vary depending upon what the authority is. And then we also talk about, again, there's a certain amount of uncertainty associated with working in coastal and marine environments. And so if we're asking for what seems like more compensation than would be asked for an inland impact, it is probably to offset that uncertainty that's inherent in working on the coast. Next. And the sections that I already talked about that are in the procedures feed into implementing this policy statement, the natural resource assessment and evaluation. This is my favorite topic because we spent the most time at NOAA talking about this policy statement, which is very similar to what's in, or at least the first part is what's in the 2008 mitigation rule. Use preservation as compensation appropriately. But in the case of working in coastal landscapes, we also want our staff to be thinking about the high risk of habitat loss in coastal marine landscapes and seascapes. So we have a whole section in the procedures that gives more details about preservation, and I'll be talking about preservation entirely later on in the agenda. All right, and our final policy statement, collaboration. Again, kind of a given. This is what we do. We collaborate with partner agencies, we collaborate with stakeholders, we do it in a timely and transparent manner, and as early in the planning and design process as possible. And we do talk in the policy about, we have different kinds of landscapes for collaboration with partner agencies and tribes. It would be great if we could develop common mitigation recommendations, common compliance approaches, criteria, and standards. And then with partner agencies, that is the appropriate scape for developing these landscape seascape plans and disseminating tools and training. And that is an overview of what's in the policy and the procedures. So there are topics we'll be getting into in more detail, and those include that landscape seascape approach, preservation, climate change. So if you have specific questions about those topics, you might want to hold them. If there's any questions on the others, I can take them now. Yes? Oh, you were just stretching. Oh, no, you were raising your hand.
Yeah, Susan Marie, I'm wondering if you can give an example of when compensation might be preferable over avoidance and minimization.
Sure. This happens in our Endangered Species Act program, where if the impact is to a low-value habitat, actually, I will be talking about that in, I guess, the next module. But briefly, to answer your question, if the impact is to a low-value habitat in an area with continuing downgrading of the habitat, then it might be better to just consider that as a lost cause and work with the applicant or the project proponent to do compensation of really high-value habitat. And again, that's for listed species where they're really looking at what's best for the species.
And I'm guessing there's a timing consideration there too, in terms
Yes.
of whether that mitigation is already available.
Yes. Now, with listed species, they're often looking at preservation because you've got ranges that you want to protect. And so in that case, the timing isn't really that much of an issue because the habitat is there, and the point is you want to keep it there. Like I said, preservation, my favorite topic. We spent so much time talking to our Assistant Administrator for Regulatory, Sam Rock, about this because he was unconvinced. But anyway, so we define preservation in the policy very similar to the way it's defined in the 2008 rule. It's removing a threat or preventing the decline of natural resources. It includes measures to maintain that habitat, to provide the level of ecological functions and services that are already there. So preservation is not necessarily passive. Sometimes it does require, the areas preserved require maintenance. Next. And so preservation can include things like putting a conservation easement on wetlands that without that easement will be developed, and that's a very common thing happening in coastal areas. Or it could include just purchasing an entire parcel with integrated habitats and donating it to a land trust along with the endowment. Next. So this is where we started talking about preservation. So how many of you have ever thought it's a cop-out, it's a way to get out of restoration? No? Okay. It doesn't really provide compensation because you're just preserving something that's already there, right? No one in the room from Alaska, but our Alaska staff are always waving their hands saying, this is the only option we have for compensation in Alaska. My perspective is that habitat's being lost so quickly that we do need to preserve it now or we won't have anything left to restore. And the scientists in the room, namely Kara, has pointed out to me that, well, preserved habitats function a lot better than restored habitats. You know, we think we're pretty good at restoring habitats, and we're a lot better than we used to be, but seriously, there's no one in this room who thinks a restored habitat is as good as a natural habitat. So that's the conversation that we've been having. Next. But again, a coastal perspective provides a few other considerations. Go on. So coastal areas are under intense development pressure. They always have been. They will continue to be, with nearly 2 out of 3 people living within 100 miles of the coast. Next. And the acreage of coastal aquatic habitats is declining rapidly. We work with the Fish and Wildlife Service and their status and trends report that comes out every 10 years, except the one time it came out every 5 years. That's, the national trend of wetland in the lower 48. And we are losing, and we worked with them to look at wetlands just in coastal watersheds. And at a time when there was very little going on a national basis. You had losses some places, gains others, so it kind of evened out. If you look just at the coastal watersheds, we were losing 80,000 acres a year between 2004 and 2009. So everyone's heard about what's happening in Louisiana, right? That's only about 20,000 acres per year. So we're losing a lot of coastal land, even outside of what's happening in the Mississippi Delta. Go ahead. Okay, so just to review, the policy statement says to use preservation of intact habitat appropriately, taking into account the high risk of habitat loss in coastal and marine landscapes and seascapes. And then it goes on to say that NOAA supports habitat preservation in limited situations. Again, language similar to what's in the 2008 rule, but that it's particularly valuable when the habitat's at risk of loss or degradation. And again, we're looking at the long-term conservation benefits that outweigh the immediate losses that might happen if you're losing an acre of wetlands and the compensation is preserving 100 acres somewhere else. You still lost that 1 acre of wetland. But we have a solution for that. We prefer actually doing them together. So we would like to see situations where you are doing some restoration to get back some of the functions and services you lost and combine that with preservation. And often the way that can work is we often work with mitigation ratios. So if you've got, for example, a 3-to-1 mitigation ratio, maybe one of that is an acre of restoration, but then the other 2 are preservation. The procedure preservation is covered under the landscape and seascape approach. Go on. And again, we've got pros and cons with this, that you do get long-term benefits where habitats are being lost rapidly, but you don't necessarily get new functions and services. Next. And by combining preservation with restoration, we get both of those things, some new functions and the long-term benefits of preservation. So, long-term benefits. This was a tough one to explain to our assistant administrator. So I'm going to walk you through what finally convinced him. So this is a hypothetical. We've got a landscape with a farmed wetland on one side, undisturbed forest on the other, river running through it, and encroaching development. Next. So if we only use restoration as compensation, that development is going to continue to encroach. We're going to, for every acre of development, we're going to restore 2 acres of farmed wetland. And what you end up with is a fair amount of restored farmed wetland, but you've got a degraded wetland forest and a loss of wetland forest. Next. If we combine that with preservation, you'll get an acre of new development, you'll get an acre of restored farmed wetland, and then you can preserve the rest of that wetland forest. And at the end of the day, you have a lot less development. It needs to go somewhere else. Sorry, can't develop there. And so you don't get the restored farmed wetland, but farmed wetlands are great for voluntary restoration programs. And so that's probably where that restoration should be funded. So this is what finally convinced Sam, and this is the process that we're hoping to implement on the ground. But it's going to take time because there are a lot of inherent prejudices against preservation as compensation. Go on. So some of the things we talk about considering is the characteristics of the preserved area. You know, is it pristine? Is it important to a species? Is it important to a managed fishery? What is the level of the current protection? If it's already not threatened, if somebody's already got a conservation easement on it, then we can't add anything by putting our conservation easement on it. Or is it genuinely vulnerable to loss? And then finally, the impact for which the preserved area would compensate. This had never occurred to me, but one of our field staff said, well, you know, sometimes when they're putting in pipelines or high-tension wires or something, they'll disturb a wetland, we'll lose functions and services, but they'll come back on their own after a while. And so maybe the best compensation for that is preservation, and because restoration is not necessary if the area is going to come back on its own. And then the procedures also talk about characteristics of the preserved area, what makes a great preservation compensation area. I've got an asterisk next to ability to persist on the landscape because in coastal areas, we can't talk about perpetuity, and we don't in the policy. But we also talk about maybe identifying areas that would be sea level rise, retreat corridors. Those are particularly helpful in areas where the marshes need places to retreat. And also talking about habitats that are identified in conservation plans, areas that act as buffers or are already considered a high-value habitat. Next. And again, whether the area is already under some kind of protection or whether it is vulnerable. Next. And whether the impact is function but not acreage. That might be a good one where preservation is appropriate compensation. Or if the impact is to a very low value habitat. And so that might be a situation where preservation would be really appropriate as compensation. We do talk about there being requirements for protecting the area, again, very similar to what's already in the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA 2008 rule about having the appropriate legal mechanisms, which vary from state to state. It would be, I think, easier to understand if there was just one way of protecting a site, but each state has its own way of doing that. And making sure that there are long-term management and maintenance plans and sufficient funding for long-term stewardship. So under the Clean Water Act, we have a lot of this language there, but it is generally under the Clean Water Act, it's been my experience, preservation is only slightly more preferred than creation. And so we'd like to have preservation be a little bit higher on that preference list in the appropriate situation. And in the NOAA programs, we have language under essential fish habitat about using preservation for difficult to replace habitats. Under the Endangered Species Act, a lot of our recovery plans recommend the preservation of critical habitat. Under our natural resources damage and assessment programs, that language about acquiring the equivalent points us sometimes towards preservation as compensation. Preservation is not used in the National Marine Sanctuaries Act because the sanctuary is already preserved and protected. So if there's damage to a sanctuary, then that does need to be fixed with restoration. And then preservation is not used under the Federal Power Act. Any questions? Yes. Wait for your microphone.
Thank you. Do you have a formula you use to calculate the stewardship endowment, or do you allow the implementer to calculate it? How do you go about that?
We do not, but there are land trust organizations, and I'll bet a number of them are here at this conference who have those kinds of formulas, or you could ask some of the bankers. I think some of the business of banking talk about that. But the formula, we don't have a formula. We rely on entities who are more familiar with that to do that kind of work.
Thank you. I was curious about your comment that you said something to the effect that you can't talk about perpetuity, I think, in coastal areas. Is that sort of a practical comment or more of a regulatory legal?
Sorry, that was a somewhat flippant comment. We'll talk about this more, but briefly, a lot of times, particularly if you're dealing with a mitigation bank, there's kind of an understood requirement that this bank needs to be in place permanently. And although the term in perpetuity is not used in the 2008 rule, we looked it up, that's the term everyone uses. It needs to be protected in perpetuity. If you're on a coastline, even long-term protection can sometimes be no more than 30 years. So that's why we're saying, look, we understand that we're in a changing landscape. We're not going to expect this compensation site to exist in 100 years. That's
so more of a sort of practical recognition that it's a more dynamic environment.
Yes.
And yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Do you have any examples of successful preservation restoration sites on the coast that you could share with us? And if so, are there any lessons learned or ways you would do it different?
I thought there were going to be other NOAA people here today who could answer that question, but it turns out they're all from the West Coast and they're not here yet. So if you want to check in with me later, I could send you a few examples. Or Catherine could answer the question.
Well, when we were kind of exploring the issue of preservation, Susan Marie mentioned Alaska came up quite often. Yeah. And there was an example, and this was kind of crossing that watershed issue as well. So they actually went out of watershed within a bay area, and then they preserved land in another space. There's also a lot of, in the West Coast region, with salmon habitat, they're sometimes doing preservation of areas for the salmon to have salmon reaches and salmon runs. There was an intern 2 summers ago who was looking at the issue of subtidal use of state-owned lands, because that's one of the challenges within NOAA that was being run into, is that a lot of times that subaquatic habitat is either owned by the state or it's owned by the federal government or whoever. And so they're looking at the issues of long-term leases. So aquaculture, oil, they're just different entities that are using these long-term leases, and can that be a form of closing up an area to impacts or other things like that. So that was another thing, because that's an added complication for the trust resources that NOAA works with.
Thanks, Catherine. You can take the woman out of NOAA, you can't take NOAA out of the woman.
I told Susan Marie I'm a talker. One of the things too that's also interesting with that sub-bottom leases is it's Virginia with the CLUAs, the conservation land use agreements that they've done, where because it's state-owned land and they may want to eventually impact it, they have an agreement that if you do impact that, you're required to compensate for it elsewhere. And so there's a trigger in that just because it's state-owned land. So that's another way to get kind of an in perpetuity in an area where you really don't have that authority to get that.
Hi, I guess regarding preservation and the in perpetuity question, another way to look at that would be the habitat that you might be originally protecting is no longer there, but if it becomes aquatic beds or a river,
Exactly.
that area is still protected. It just might be something else, right?
That's true.
So I don't think you need to downplay, that protection as much, just that the habitat may change naturally.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, yeah.
Similar to, Mount Rainier exploded and wiped out a mitigation bank or something, right? It changes. Hopefully it doesn't happen anytime soon. And I agree, habitat loss is happening at such a rapid rate that potentially preservation should be looked at differently. I think as long as the ratios are maintained where, you're preserving an adequate amount compared to the impact is one thing. And also some areas may be so heavily developed, there is no place other than preservation to do a decent or sizable, mitigation site. So preservation may be the best option in some locations.
Yeah, and particularly in urban areas, there's an interesting tension going on right now with cities wanting to do managed development and trying to make the decision between expanding beyond boundaries that they set 20 years ago, or looking at infilling the undeveloped areas within their development boundary. And a lot of people would say, well, it makes sense to stay within the development boundary and just fill in those vacant areas. Well, those vacant areas are the only green space that city people get to see. And so that would be, I guess, an asterisk on the preservation of pristine habitat requirement, because I think in urban areas you need to be thinking similar to how you can't think about being permanent when you're on the coast. When you're in a city, you can't think about things have to be pristine. Sometimes they're not pristine, but that's okay because it's a city. I also wanted to add, I'll get to you in a second, I wanted to add on to your comment about getting the ratios right. When the gentleman over here started asking about a formula, what I thought you were going to ask for is a formula for calculating how much preservation is appropriate for a given impact. One of the people on our West Coast who is not here yet actually has used something called the mitigation calculator, which is a tool very similar to habitat equivalency analysis, which is used in our NERDA programs. And she has found a way to use that calculator to actually calculate the appropriate amount of preservation, and I'm looking forward to talking to her about that. But usually, again, we're back to ratios, 10 to 1, 20 to 1, start high, negotiate down. That's kind of the way we do it. Yes, another question.
I was going to comment on something earlier, and then there were several things that came up in between, but I'll go back to my original thought was Lindsay's question about examples of a combination of preservation and restoration in coastal areas. I was thinking in Massachusetts, there's lots of opportunities for restoring degraded salt marshes. And on some of the projects that are now underway, pilot projects and new projects emerging, many of them are maybe on land that's already preserved by an NGO, but there's also opportunities to expand. So there are efforts underway to acquire, adjacent land. So some kind of, so there's I think an opportunity that we're interested in our program. Sometimes, the land is very expensive and you may need to there may need to be acquisition first
Right.
before you can, so that's, we've been approached in some situations like that to acquire land when, our priority may be to look for restoration first. So finding those areas where you can do both would be great.
Right.
But that's an example. I think that's a big opportunity in Massachusetts.
Yeah, and I guess that you could think of that as being kind of staged compensation. First, so you're talking about acquiring land that is not pristine, it needs restoration.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't acquire it, someone will go in and develop it. So then you're acquiring land to be restored later. That's what I love about in lieu fee programs. You have so much flexibility.
Any comment on that, Taylor?
And then,
Yeah, so outside of Alaska, I'd say that we're not too far behind with the amount of preservation that was utilized up in New England. We have 3 states that was the priority for implementation of mitigation. And so I got one caveat to preservation is that our division or our district has gone preservation for so long that it's weeded out a lot of restoration opportunities. As in a lot of the practitioners, it's hard to return back to restoration now that preservation has become such a priority. And so we're slowly doing it state by state. Mass has got, it depends on what's in the service area to restore, but
Right.
we do utilize preservation. And I was going to comment on the urban preservation, because when we look at cumulative impacts, we say, well, this is the last resource within this area. But
Right.
that's also can be used for preservation. It's like, this is our last resource, even though it's degraded and not
Yes.
up to a reference site that you might get in the rural areas, that this is also, as valuable, if not more valuable.
right,
But, with our policy is that you also have policy on the other shoulder saying that, our mitigation rule says that we need to be restoring, restore, return the functions. It says preservation, yes, is allowable, but ultimately that we have to, return these services because that's part of our rule. So I do like the preservation. It's just that we have to be careful, or when considering it, especially up in New England, is that we've done it for so long that we've lost the ability to really facilitate good restoration projects. And we don't
that's too
have, we
bad.
have 0 bankers. We have 1 possible banker that's going to do an eelgrass project. But we don't have a lot of practitioners who are, well-versed in restoration because it's just been preserved for so long. So I will
right.
say that.
So that's an opportunity for anyone who's ever wanted to live and work in New England.
Just to comment on that, I think 2 things. One is that I think that this sort of, need to sort of prioritize the restoration in New England with the in lieu fee policy. And there's also, I think, an opportunity for finding synergies with other sources of funding where you want
Right.
to do a bigger project that needs some preservation as well. And then on the restoration thing, there is actually a lot of expertise and practitioners and stuff in restoration in general, but it's not the mitigation, not on
Right.
the mitigation side. There's a lot of there's the voluntary restoration, or with the restoration that comes from other sources of funding.
Yeah. And the monitoring requirements for compensatory mitigation are much more involved, as I understand it, than with many of the voluntary restoration projects. So that would be one thing that I might scare off someone who is used to doing voluntary restoration from getting into the compensatory mitigation field, because that monitoring requirement is more stringent, I think.
I think once we provide funding, we've found once we provide guidance and the funding for that, it makes it a little bit more palatable.
Good. Anyone else?
I kind of have a question, and this might be directed at some of the core people as well. So I'm curious about one of the reasons to use preservation is for temporal losses, and how often is that being done? Is there typically compensation for things that are just expected to recover? Kind of what is that threshold for temporal loss before you look at something and say this needs to be compensated for? Or is that something that could be an area that a reset might be helpful when thinking about temporal loss as being something that might require
So you're talking
compensation.
about the situation where a pipeline is going in or high
Yes.
tension wires and there's disturbance, but it comes back on its own, but it comes back slowly, so you've got that temporal loss and
Yeah, so at what point does temporal loss trigger compensation? Is that happening, or is that something that might need kind of a refresh? Because the 2008 rule does allow for compensation of temporal losses. Or, you know, I've also heard some people talk about changes in habitat type. Like, it's still going to be a wetland, but it's changing to a different habitat type, you know.
a very disturbed wetland.
Right, and so, you know, you know, how is that working, and is that an interplay for preservation?
So anyone from the Corps, like, I think just pass it to your right. Come on, Ryan. You're it.
In our experience with the Jacksonville district, the only time that I've actually required mitigation for a temporal loss was when you go from a forested wetland to an herbaceous one. So when you have a power line that comes through and they have to cut a huge swath through a cypress swamp or something, and what comes back is just going to be a marsh, we typically ask for some sort of mitigative compensation on that end, because it'll never come back the way they want, because they're going to have to keep it that way because they don't want the trees getting up into the lines. We've done that for that's pretty much the only one that I think I've done. I haven't done that for seagrass, because typically they'll go in there. Oh no, I take that back. No, we have done that for seagrass, where they couldn't do HDD underneath it, and they had to do a trench. We made them come back, and we usually did a ratio, 2 to 1 of some sort, and then we make them monitor that for a minimum of 5 years, and we're looking for roughly 70% coverage after that for the seagrasses. I think that's the only other one. Have you had any?
There's been many times where we've required mitigation for temporal loss, but most of my experience has been in South Florida, so preservation, there's not much land left to preserve, or it's super duper expensive. So mitigation banks are typically much more reasonable for folks to go to than preservation. I would say, I think because my experience has been mostly South Florida, your example that you convinced Sam Rock with, I was going the opposite, because there's been several examples where we've had entities that do voluntary restoration that have specifically chosen not to go for the high quality lands because they feel none of the agencies would ever issue a permit for development on those sites. So we're going to save our money and go buy elsewhere. That's not
If
fun.
only that were the case, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I thought of that. I'm like, well, that's really interesting. It completely depends on which area you are in the
Yes.
world, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, Sam's a lawyer, so basically I just had to give him the concept, not the real world example. Yeah. So I just wanted to end by saying that all those opinions that I started this presentation with are represented among the National Marine Fisheries staff who are working out in the regions. And just because we publish a policy from headquarters doesn't mean everything's going to change right away. So be patient. Stop laughing, Catherine. Some of our staff are more on board with this than others. But I hope over time we'll get there.